All three stories are viewer submissions of close encounters with mimes, and allegedly true. We changed the names to protect the identities of the victims. Each story may or may not be slightly altered for animation purposes. The intention of this video isn't to tarnish the reputation of mimes, or any street workers or performers for that matter. It's to simply bring awareness to situations that may arise when you meet a street worker with malicious, no good intentions. That being said, here's what the first creepy mime encounter looks like. This happened to me while I was camping with my boyfriend. There was this spot we frequented every time we went, and we would go every year near the start of the spring. Just when things started getting warmer, we did the usual, like set up our tent. Then my boyfriend would start building a fire. We planned to keep it going through the night for light and warmth. The area was nice. There was a little pond near us where you could feed some ducks nearby. That's when I saw some guy standing on the other side of the pond, at the edge of a stand of trees. He was in his mid-40s, wearing blue jeans and a plaid shirt with an old trucker hat. When I spotted him, he didn't look away or wave. He just stood there staring at me. I pointed him out to my boyfriend, who stopped what he was doing and waved at the guy, but he didn't do anything but continued to gawk at us like a weirdo. I could tell my boyfriend was getting pissed off because he could tell I was feeling uneasy. That's when my boyfriend turned back towards the man and had a tense standoff for a few minutes. I knew my boyfriend didn't want to approach the man either in case he was armed, but he wasn't about to let him watch us all night. After a long, awkward stare down, the man eventually just turned around and walked away, back into the woods. Neither of us could make sense of what had just happened, but once my boyfriend got the fire going, we weren't too worried about it anymore. The sun was setting as the fire started to rage. When I started camping, I wasn't a fan, but as my boyfriend showed me the ropes, I grew to love it. We indulged in doing what all campers do, roasting hot dogs and marshmallows over the open flame, stargazing, and shameless activities in the tent before collapsing into a sleeping bag. However, this would be the night everything changed for me. After being jostled around by my boyfriend and backed up for days prior, I had to take a shit. But I felt really anxious and uncomfortable doing it out in the woods so late at night. I heard so many noises like bugs, twigs snapping, and bristling bushes around our tent. It sounded like someone or something was out there. After a few minutes, I eventually got myself to calm down and eluded the noise to simply nature. That's when I decided to handle my bathroom business. I didn't want to wake up my boyfriend just in case I was being paranoid, so I grabbed a flashlight and slowly started making my way out of the tent. But before I left, I poked my head out and looked around the campsite, just to make sure there was nothing around. And sure enough, there was nothing there, just the campfire still running nearby. So I stepped out and walked into the woods, not going too deep, but far enough that my boyfriend wouldn't smell anything if he woke up. That's when I found a suitable tree and leaned against it. I then dug a small hole, dropped my pants around my ankles, and then got to business. I was literally right in the middle of it when I started hearing the sounds of twigs snapping again. I looked around with the flashlight but couldn't see anything. I felt so vulnerable, like I had to finish and get dressed right away. Then as soon as it was over with, the pressure in my ears went away, and I heard it. It felt like breathing, like something coming from right behind me. I slowly turned the flashlight and looked over my shoulder, and there, just inches away, was a goddamn mime. I screamed and jumped backwards, frantically trying to pull up my pants. As the psycho smiled at me, he reached down into the hole I had just dug, picked up the entire log of shit, and smeared it all over his face. That's when I got up and ran away as fast as I could, then ripped my boyfriend out of the tent. I told him what I had just saw, but he was in disbelief, still shaking off the sleep. I kept looking around in a panic, but again, nothing. I forced my boyfriend to pack everything up and leave on the spot. We were able to move quickly and into the car. On the way home, he kept asking me questions about what happened, I kept saying exactly what went down, but he had a hard time believing me. He tried to convince me that I had just seen a bear in the dark, but I know what I saw. We never went camping again, obviously. I ended up having to break up with him after he continually made fun of my experience to everyone we knew, claiming I was just making up a story as an excuse for not wiping, and all sorts of other terrible things that should never be said about someone who lived through a traumatic experience. Unfortunately, I knew there was no use calling the cops. They'd be even less believing than my ex, and there wasn't really any crime committed. I do, however, wholeheartedly believe the mime was the man who was staring at us at the beginning of the evening. I just hope I never see him or another mime ever again. When I was still living with my parents, I had the luxury of living within walking distance of downtown. I didn't have to commute by bus or train or anything. I could literally get there in about 20 minutes tops. I remember walking there one day to meet up with two of my buddies. There was a really popular part of town with an open-air mall. We looked around in the shops but didn't buy anything as we didn't have a lot of money to spend. We mostly just messed around and caused trouble. The place was always packed, especially on the weekends, so it was easy to get away with doing stuff and not get caught. The whole night was fun. However, we all had curfews, so we eventually had to go our separate ways and head home. That was around 8, when it was dark out and the place was getting busier than ever, and also when a lot more of the street performers would come out. Out of all the performers I saw, one stuck out to me. It was a mime. I already disliked mimes more than regular clowns, but this guy was intense. His face paint was scary as hell and his face looked almost inhuman, like in the Terrifier movies. I wanted to just walk past him, but there was a huge crowd around him standing in my way at a bus stop. I don't know why so many people were interested in him, but he was apparently quite captivating. I stopped at the edge of the crowd, and that's when I saw the mime parting his way through it, trying to get to me. He was staring at me, doing his mime act, and it was starting to freak me out. I felt trapped for some reason, because the weirdo started putting up invisible walls with his hands. He was pulling them up from the ground and hammering them together. I'd never seen a mime do that. Then, I realized he was building a box around me, and the whole time, he kept staring at me. I've always been claustrophobic, and even though I knew they weren't real walls, I still couldn't stand the idea of being trapped. All the people in the crowd were staring at me, laughing at my reaction, making the whole situation even worse. I panicked and ran home. I was terrified, so I ran for a solid 5 minutes, putting what I thought was more than enough distance behind me. I had to get away from the crowds, out of downtown, back to the calmer section of the walk home. I was only about 10 minutes away since I had run so far, but I was out of breath, so I decided to take a break. When I resumed heading home, I took it easy. I needed to keep myself from having some kind of panic attack again. But then, a few blocks from my house, I spotted a figure ahead of me, standing motionless below a streetlight. As I got closer, my heart sank as I realized it was the same mime. He was staring directly at me, smiling like a creep. I didn't understand how the hell he got there, or if this was some kind of mime look-alike. I just knew I had no choice but to keep going toward him. My house was at the end of the street, and there was no other path to take to get there. I could have gone to the other side of the street, but I was pissed at this guy for humiliating me just as much as I was scared of him, so I wanted to prove that he couldn't get a reaction out of me. I slowly approached him, watching his every move. That's when he started putting up invisible walls again, but not a box this time, more like a barrier. He pretended to block off the sidewalk, even going over the sides to the curb and into the person's yard he was standing in front of. It took everything I had to not stop or turn around when I got up to him. All I wanted to do was casually walk right through his mime wall, and that's exactly what I did. Only I didn't expect what would happen when I crossed through it. The mime screamed and almost bit my head off. I sprinted away as fast as I could. He started chasing me, almost grabbing me at an arm's length. I kept running and running until I reached the point that I thought I was going to collapse. But then I kept going. Finally, I was able to round a corner with enough distance to jump into a bush and hide behind it. The mime ran right past me and kept going, giving me a moment to breathe. I gave it a few seconds. Then I jumped out of the bush and ran the other way, going back toward downtown. I wanted people around just in case that freak found me again, and I didn't want him to know where I lived. I eventually found safety inside a convenience store where I called my dad. He came to pick me up a few minutes later. We called the police, and I told them everything that happened, but there wasn't enough to go on for them to really do anything about it. I didn't know what he actually looked like or anything else about him. I thankfully haven't seen him since, but not knowing kills me. He could be anywhere. He could find me at any moment. Every time I see a mime now, I have an anxiety attack. There's always a split-second reaction I have where I think it's him, before I realize it's just a normal mime only, but I can never really know. When I was in high school, I had this friend named Thomas. We had gone to the same middle school together but got split up in my freshman year. But we stayed in touch and hung out occasionally. During one weekend, he invited me to sleep over at his place. Thomas was an only child who lived with just his dad. They lived in a small house since his dad was divorced, so it was just the two of them. Plus, Thomas's dad was pretty chill and let us stay up as late as we wanted. I remember this one night. We gamed, watched TV, ordered pizza, that kind of vibe. When it was time to pass out, Thomas slept in his bed, of course, while I slept on the floor in my sleeping bag. I fell asleep fairly quickly, as I've always been a light sleeper. About an hour later, I woke up to a creaking noise. I looked around and realized the bedroom door had just opened a little. I assumed Thomas or myself must have forgotten to close the door properly. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep with that thing open, so I got up and closed the door. Then I went back to my sleeping bag. I eventually was able to fall back asleep, but then an hour later, I was woken up again. This time, I had to pee. I knew I wasn't going to be able to sleep properly with a full bladder, so I got up to use the washroom. But as I was getting out of my sleeping bag, I saw the door open again. Now I had chills running down my spine. It was just open by a little bit like the last time, and I was certain that I had shut it fully earlier. Despite being weirded out, I forced myself to go and take a piss. So, I opened the door the rest of the way and stood there for a bit before stepping through, just to make sure it was clear, and it was. Then I walked across the hall to the bathroom to do my business. When I came back to the bedroom, I closed the door again, making sure that it was absolutely shut. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and forced myself to try and fall asleep once again, eluding the situation to just the airflow in the house causing the door to open. Barely an hour later, I woke up tossing and turning in my sleeping bag. I was struggling to fall asleep for some reason. That's when I opened my eyes slightly amidst my sleep, and was chilled to my core, only to see that the door was wide open. I shot up and looked for Thomas, but he wasn't in his bed. I looked around the room and saw him standing facing the wall, slowly banging his forehead over and over again. I was freaked the hell out and saying something like,
"Thomas, what the hell are you doing? You're scaring the shit out of me! Thomas? Thomas! Ah! What the hell is going on?"
That's when out of nowhere, a scary-ass looking mime came into the room and was standing right over me. I screamed and fell backwards, trying to get to my feet as the mime came closer and closer. He was smiling with a face like a demon straight from hell, as he put a finger to one side of his throat and dragged it across his neck to the other side. He then bent over and smiled as he was getting in my face.
"What do you want from me? Stay away from me! Please! Thomas! Help me!"
The mime said nothing. He just pretended to tie a noose and wrap it around my neck as I was paralyzed with fear. He then made a motion to tighten it, and I literally felt the pressure. Then, he took the other end and started pulling on it. I don't even know how it was even possible, but in that moment, my feet lifted off the ground. I was mid-air as the mime was looking at me dead in the eyes. As he hanged me by an imaginary rope, I didn't know what to do. I tried to claw at the rope, but it was pointless. Finally, as I felt my death quickly approaching, I had a rush of adrenaline and kicked the mime as hard as I could with both feet. Finally breaking free, I crashed to the floor and sprinted the hell out of the house, abandoning all my belongings. The only possession of mine I was able to bring was my phone, which was already in my pocket. I remember running down the street until I was a few blocks down. There, I called an Uber and got home just as dawn hit. Soon after, I started getting texts from Thomas, acting like nothing happened, asking me stuff like why I left early since we had plans for the following day, and stuff like that. I just ghosted him. I didn't know what the hell to say to him. All I knew is that I never wanted to see him again. I don't know what Thomas and his dad had going on in that house, but it's evil. Thankfully, Thomas and I don't go to the same school anymore, so I haven't had to see him since. Till this day, I also can't stop thinking about what happened that night. Sometimes, I can still feel the rope around my neck.